speaker this
Only one
afternoon
unknown person here.
at this CCPL Center of Comparative Public Law Center. Actually, the speaker, Mr. Walter Lee, is not giving his first seminar at our center because some time ago in 2013, he also gave a seminar here on the legality of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect in classical China, which was related to his PhD research, which he has been doing at the University of Auckland, where he has been studying in recent years. Previously, he studied at the University of Warwick, where he obtained his MA in International Relations. And Mr. Lee has also been a visiting scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing.
Right.
So today he is going to talk about a new topic, which is, I suppose, also related to his PhD research, which is reinventing cosmopolitanism, international legal order in classical Chinese canons. So it looks like a very grand and interesting topic, and I'm sure we all look forward to Mr. Lee's presentation.
Okay.
Look at the PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's easy. Thank you very much, Professor Chen, and it's very happy to see all of you here. And as Professor just mentioned, this is my second visit to the faculty and also the center. And this is actually part of my PhD thesis. And I'm actually, at the moment, I'm actually waiting for my viva, so you can all be my examiners today. So I welcome all kinds of criticism or comments. So here we begin. So this is the flow of my talk today. And I guess Chinese cosmopolitan is something like what you won't hear very often. And so from the angle of legal political studies, I actually personally I believe there is a poverty of such an idea. And I'm going to talk about a methodological platform, so how I actually build a methodology to bridge the classical Chinese conceptions and also the modern legal concepts and political theories. So I had to build up such a platform in order to talk more. And then we have some examples from the late Qing period to the Republican period and also the PRC. That some scholars, they try to use classical Chinese conceptions to construct kind of Chinese IR concepts. And the fourth part is what I call the knowledge archaeology of Chinese international relations. There's more reasons. So starting from, I guess, the recent 1 or 2 decades, starting from the scholars in Beijing and also those in the UK and also the US as well. Quite lots of scholars, they want to dig into those classical resources and try to see that, okay, what we can actually do with them. And I'll argue that there are actually a lot of problems, okay? A lot of problems in using this kind of thing. So the most important issue there would be what I call the fundamentalist hermeneutics. So actually it's a problem of interpretation, how we look at those classical texts, right? So I'm a more like globalist and cosmopolitan person. So from my perspective, we'd be like, okay, if we want to contribute something, by using those classical conceptions, we want to contribute something to nowadays international politics or Chinese IR, then I guess it's better to replace the fundamentalist hermeneutics with a reinvented cosmopolitanism. And that has to do with the entrepreneurship of international legal norms as well. So by talking about Chinese cosmopolitanism, I'm not referring to, say, areas in intellectual history or sociology, anthropology, or cultural studies, because Chinese cosmopolitanism has already been increasingly discussed and debated in those areas. What I'm more focusing on is the international political and legal theory. And what is going on in these areas is that, on the one hand, China's voice has been marginalized, if not excluded, by the Western-dominated discourses. On the other hand, China seems to have little intention to speak up in this area, in cosmopolitanism. The keywords for the early 21st century China nationalism, patriotism, statism, ethnocentrism, and exceptionalism. And yet, we are talking about the rise of China as a great power. We are talking about China's increasing engagement with the international society. We are talking about China as a responsible stakeholder in international affairs. So my concern will be how to make China more inclusive within its territory and more engaging on the outside, especially on how it may contribute to the democratization of the discussion of the international rule of law and global justice. So I actually use the term comparative jurisprudence. I actually kind of like make up the term. And I have a reason for that. I use that to describe the method applied in justifying the comparability between traces of international law in the pre-Qin era and modern international law. The method, together with the Chinese origin of international law, what I call the 公法中原 debate, will serve as a platform for the context textual study in the Chinese origin of cosmopolitan legal order. Now, some may wonder why I didn't use international and comparative law instead of the more peculiar term comparative jurisprudence. The reason is this. The Western monopoly in the definition of international law has posed difficulty for us to label the method with the term international. The universalistic feature of the Eurocentric international law has made cross-ethno-cultural comparison unnecessary. One may wonder what is left to compare within the framework of jus gentium, law of nations. And the Western monopoly has also prevented us from using the term comparative law, because the study of comparative law usually denies the existence of international law in the non-Western cultures and legal traditions. Chinese law, including findings in the pre-Qin era, is usually marginalized by comparative law as nothing more than a regional strand of law titled the Asian legal tradition, alongside common law and civil law. The connection between Chinese law and international law is very rarely mentioned in the study of comparative law. The cosmopolitan vision of international law has remained kind of a utopian dream. And I think it's quite interesting to show you two quotations. So this one is actually something about, it's taken from Peter de Cruz writings, and he mentioned that the statute of the International Court of Justice, it mentions that international law is kind of like the general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. And when you compare this with what Oppenheim talks about, international law does not recognize any distinctions in the membership of the international community based on religious, geographical, or cultural differences. I guess it's kind of like contradictory. Because on the one hand, you talk about, the ICJ's use of civilized nations, I think is discriminatory. What is the standard of the civilization anyway? And who are the uncivilized? And are they excluded? If they're excluded, then how come international law can be said as universal? And what should be regarded as generally accepted legal principles is also disputed. There has yet been a proper comparative study of which legal principles are legally accepted. So comparative jurisprudence, therefore, becomes a survival gap, I guess. And what comparative law is yet to do may actually be achieved by comparative jurisprudence. And Peter de Cruz, he actually mentioned a concept called the theories of convergence, and he says that the common nature of human beings will eventually lead to the creation of similar social structures, laws, and legal systems. This common nature will therefore be observed and expressed by law. Comparative jurisprudence may follow such vision and categorize itself as a method capable to critically re-examine legal agenda, heritages of ideas and conceptual tools, to be interested in both the local and the global, to think in more global terms so as to maintain a pluralist and democratized perspective of international law. And some may also wonder why my research doesn't apply the third world approaches to international law, so that TWILE. So TWILE actually puts colonialism and imperialism at the heart of international law. It argues international law are actually ingrained in, it argues colonialism and imperialism are actually ingrained in international law as we know it today, and that we should not forget international law's imperial past and violent origins. I think it is a critical voice sympathetic to the oppressed third world, but my view is we must also remember one can hardly innovatively construct something concrete by standing at the periphery all the time. And the ethical and intellectual necessity of applying a global inclusive method can also arguably trace back to Johann Wolfgang Goethe's concept of Volksliteratur, so world literature. Such attempts to break borders of the political and linguistic traditions has a grand utopian vision of global synthesis or underlying commonality. It is explicitly a universalist vision in which the particularities of specific national traditions are both embraced for their own sakes and seen together as part of a transcendent whole. So we actually have some examples of using classical Chinese concepts in international relations. So the earliest one we can find is actually from the late Qing period. So what we call the Chinese origin of international law debates, the 公法中原 debates. And these scholars actually use the hermeneutic method called 格义, okay, the matching concepts of meanings. It is a Chinese Buddhist method of interpretation originated from the 1st century. It aims to make sense of the concepts found in the Sanskrit canons to the Confucian scholars by comparing those concepts with the similar ones found in classical Chinese canons. The debates actually had a bitter beginning. For modern China, the learning of international law came with foreign aggression during the century of humiliation. As a practical and psychological response, China desperately yearned for something within its own indigenous language and culture that is comparable to modern international law. It wanted to make international law locally comprehensible. The findings of the debates are twofold. First, international law may exist in the pre-Qing China. And second, international law in the pre-Qing China may be applicable to the rest of the world. And in China, the debates can be divided into 4 phases. The first phase actually runs from 1861 to 1895 during the self-strengthening movement. And one of the most prominent publications is the Traces of International Law in Ancient China by William Martin. And I guess most of you know him. He's a very kind of famous in the history of how international law being introduced to China. And Martin has found a Grotian and Kantian echo in the Book of Rights, Oikojoli, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, that is Chunqiu. So these 2 very important canons in Chinese history. So these two texts are the central texts for the search of traces of international law and laws of war in the pre-Qing China. And after that, we have some other scholars. This is just a summary table. Sorry for the font, it's a bit small. But it briefly shows you after Martin, you still have the other scholars, say like during the 100 Days Reform period, then say those reformers, they have a similar argument. Say Liang Qichao in his On Mentions, 读孟子借说, published in 1898, he says Hugo Grotius wrote international law, while Confucius wrote Chunqiu as eternal laws for the world. And Tan Sitong also argues Grotius on the law of war and peace is a work of righteousness and benevolence. It elaborates the rules illustrated in Gong Yang's interpretation of Chunqiu. And then when it comes to the Republican era, you have some diplomats and also some scholars from China. They are pretty much liberal institutionalists. So say, for example, Wellington Koo, Hu Weijun, he has a speech called The Ancient China's League of Nations, given on the 21st of August 1944, and he compares the pre-Qing international legal order with the League of Nations. He draws references from Confucius and Mozi when he talks about universal human rights. And he said, in his words, the thought of universal brotherhood has been deeply rooted in the minds of the Chinese for more than 2,000 years. And when it comes to the PRC period, I guess it's starting from the end of the Cultural Revolution, say from 1976, and you start, I mean, the country is actually open up. And you've got, say, people like Judge Wang Tianyang, know that he's really famous in Chinese international law. And in his lecture given to the Hague Academy of International Law in 1990, he argues the most eminent international law, he argues the principles and rules emerged in the relations among the feudal principalities under the Zhou dynasty. They're actually kind of similar to what we find in modern international law. So the implication of the Gongfa Zhongyuan debate, the Chinese origin of international law debate, is different interpretations of the two classical canons, the Book of Rights and also the Spring and Autumn Annals, these two texts, results in different understandings of international law, different orientations to international ethics, and different worldviews. The hermeneutics of the two canons are of fundamental importance to the innovation of thought in Chinese IR today. While Martin strove to bridge the old imperial China with modern international legal order, the late Qing intelligentsia aspired to rebuild the self-confidence of traditional Chinese culture amidst the lamentable years of lost wars and civil unrest. The reinterpretation of the two classical Chinese canons can be read as a reactive measure to the pressure from Western modernity. And I'll argue in Chinese history, each attempt to reinterpret the two classical Chinese canons is a political thermometer for China's attitude in reshaping its position on international ethics and worldview. Today, the significance of evaluating the canons is not just about how the PRC reconstructs its position on international ethics and worldview, but how the reconstructed Chinese norms and principles may influence the ethics and worldview of the West, the rest, and other actors in IR. In the past 1.5 centuries, in the face of a rapidly changing international order and the urge to reform its indigenous culture, Chinese scholars and government officials had to think hard for special ways to adapt to Western legal norms and values. They looked into classical canons for answers. Now the same question remains. The PRC has to position itself, that is to find itself, in the contestation between Westphalian and post-Westphalian values. There is an urgent need to look into the canons for the answers again. We should look beyond legal positivism and investigate if there has ever been a Chinese tradition that is akin to natural law, which can make meaningful conversation with today's global norms of liberal and cosmopolitan values. So that's how we come to the methodology here. So when we come back to the 21st century, in the past 1 or 2 decades, there have been a growing number of literatures in the application of classical Chinese history and philosophy to the study of Chinese IR. And I have categorized them into 3 groups. And I've made out my own as well, so the last one, the revised approach. So the Tsinghua school approach serves as the ideational origin and the evidential foundation for most debates in what I call the class here. While the American and British approach, they apply the same method, so they use those old texts as well. But then they also critique around the Tsinghua approach. The contemporary use of classical Chinese canons for the innovation of norms, principles, and the creation of theories in Chinese IR started with a team of academics at the Institute of International Studies, now called the Institute of Modern International Relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Under the leadership of Professor Yan Xuetong, the dean of the institute, the team started in 2005 to research into the philosophical and historical texts of the pre-Qin era. In particular, the school focuses heavily on Sun Tzu's inspiration for the PRC. Sorry, that's Xun, not Sun Tzu. Although emphasizing much on the necessity of morality, harmony, and peace, Professor Yan's he actually based his research largely on the new realist and unquestionably statist assumptions. And this is evident from how he correlates the pre-Qin text to conceptions such as authority, force, instincts, selfishness, system, etc. Yan's argument is nothing but an expression of the expansion of the Chinese ethnocentric and statist evil, carrying a heavy realist weight. In fact, among the 7 schools of pre-Qin thought he has compared, Yan actually favored Sun Tzu's choice of guideline, which was later developed into what he called moral realism, rather than theories from Lao Tzu, from Confucius, from Mencius, or from Mo Tzu. The inclination of applying only one school of thought, plus Professor Yan's connection with the party, actually reminds us the political reform that Shangyang implemented for the states of Qin back in the 4th century BC. First, academics serve only the rulers or the state's interests. Second, it is part of the self-strengthening reform to make the states strong enough to break any balancing acts of other states. The high concentration on one thought for one reform in one unified country has been central to the Chinese political tradition since Qin dynasty's time. And in summary, I found that the Tsinghua approach, they are not actually very scientific, although they claim themselves to be very scientific, but there is nothing actually very scientific in it.
Why? What do you mean scientific?
Because they actually claim that what they are arguing is actually kind of a matter of fact. So kind of like scientific facts there. And of course they draw heavy references from the American realist school of thought. And I guess Professor Yan himself, he got his PhD from University of California, Berkeley. I guess he's a student of Kenneth Walls also. So he's actually like from that strand of scholarship. And my argument will be like, there is no need to pursue a scientific objectivity in the study of pre-Qin text, because the study of text is inevitably subjective. So I'm actually standing more like from a anti-foundationalist stance, not those positivist stance. And the study of pre-Qin text should be an open arena for all possible interpretations to emerge, to communicate, to debate, and to synchronize with the minimal intervention posed by the power structure, such as the state. Realism should be tolerated as one of the interpretations, but not the only interpretation of the classical text. For the purpose of creating an innovative Chinese norm or principle in IR, an emancipation of historiography and worldview is essential. And there is, of course, another scholar you may actually know, Zhao Tinghang. He's actually very famous in suggesting the idea of tianxia, and this is very relevant to the study of Chinese cosmopolitanism. And again, I guess he's got very interesting ideas, of course, I think. But then,
where do you Fichao Yang is not the Tsinghua approach.
No, not the Tsinghua, but well, that's actually one of my faults. I should actually, you know, like put.
Is that Cass or was it Cass?
Sorry.
He was at Cass at the China.
Yeah. I guess he's still at the Department of Philosophy or something there at CASS. Yeah, and but from my view, I sort of think that he's sort of his argument is sort of ethnocentric and paternalistic as well, especially when you look at how he compared his cosmopolitan view with the Chinese family concept. And
ethnocentric and paternalistic.
Paternalistic, and I mean, honestly, I know how a Chinese family works. I'm totally 100% Chinese. You know? They were actually, like, of course, very positive thing. You know, we've got really wonderful things in Chinese family, but also some problems there as well. So when you are going to propagandize the whole concept of Chinese family into a global cosmopolitan thing, then there are actually lots of problems. Say, like, how can you make non-Chinese people understand your concept of Chinese family, right? And when you talk about those problems in Chinese paternalism, then I guess you always have a lot of headaches there. At least from my view. So it also involves a lot of hierarchy, and I guess an obsession for normality as well. What is being normal, right? And what is abnormal, and sometimes a lack of empathy as well. You know, this is actually one of the problems we find in paternalism. You know, like, say, like parents, we've got a lot of love for our kids or whatever, but then sometimes there is a lack of empathy. You know, like you have to understand like how other people think about something or feel about something. So this is actually like a problem when you apply those concepts in international politics and law. And so again, a table here, and you've got the free schools, and for the British school, actually, they are more like the post-structuralists, I found, and especially under the leadership of Professor William Callaghan, originally from the University of Manchester, and now teaching, I guess he's teaching at LSE now. So he's written a lot on post-structuralist critic on Chinese politics, especially in the area of Chinese IR. And very interesting and very deconstructive, but then I can't find anything very constructive.
That's the concept.
Yeah.
You're difficult to please.
Yeah. I'm being too demanding. But then very interesting. I mean, so I think all three of the schools, they have their own merits there. Even the Tsinghua school, you know, that the very unique advantage of the Tsinghua scholars is that they can read Chinese. Most of them, they are the mainland Chinese scholars. They can actually read directly the classical Chinese text, which is something that a lot of the Americans and British scholars, they can't do. And if you want to understand those classical texts, of course, language is always a problem, right? So the Chinese scholars, they've got this advantage of going back to the text, but then, of course, the point of view sometimes is actually quite questionable. And so for each of these schools, they've got their own advantages. And if you want to make a better version of the knowledge archaeology of Chinese international relations, I think it's good to think about how we can actually take the best things from each school and to try to mix that together, right? So we need, yeah.
I think you jumped over the American school, or maybe I just wasn't listening.
Oh yeah, okay.
And by critique of Yan, you mean Yuan Zhuitong?
Sorry.
Victoria Tin or Hui.
Yeah, she's actually very critical of Professor Yan. And it's actually kind of like really, I can say, very entertaining thing to read those mutual bombardments. You know, they've got some journal articles like criticizing each other. And Victoria Hui is actually very outspoken in opposing Chinese totalitarianism, and she's
Chinese
totalitarianism, and she's actually using
She's
sort
what
of.
home is she?
She's teaching at Notre Dame University.
Hong Kong.
She's from Hong Kong. Yeah, but then she's teaching in the US now. So she actually dig into the historiographical problem in Chinese IR. And she tended to argue that the way the Tsinghua scholars understand Chinese history is something very unscientific. And
Right.
unscientific
Okay.
and unhistorical. In her language, it's unhistorical.
So they're all correlated.
Yeah, so pretty much exciting, you know, when you look at those the arguments there. And so I guess I don't have the time to mention Qin Yaqing, but then I believe that he's kind of like a more reasonable scholar in mainland China to argue that, okay, I guess he's more like balance-minded person, suggesting, okay, China should be more like open to the outside, but then not losing its own national stance as well. So he's actually quite good, but yeah, so my approach will be like, I want to do something first deconstructive, but then constructive. I mean, in order to get a better hermeneutics, a better way to interpret those texts, you have to deconstruct the old ossified way of interpreting those texts. But then that's not the end of the story. You have to construct something on the other hand. So so two things there. So this is a definition I give to a revised version of the Chinese, the knowledge archaeology of Chinese IR. So I guess the most important point there is that we are actually adding a voice to the open debate. So I'm not actually suggesting that my argument is actually kind of like dominating one, should be like dominating one, you know. I'm actually arguing against Professor Yan, and I'm also arguing against the British and American scholars, and they have to listen to me. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm actually adding a voice to the open debate of how to use classical Chinese concepts for Chinese IR. So I think it's healthy, you know, for us to have different voices there, rather than just, you know, some orthodox interpretations. So that's how I come to fundamentalist hermeneutics, and I actually refer to the strict adherence to extremely dogmatic interpretation of the founding text of an ideology, and only one interpretation is accepted as legitimate. So this kind of fundamentalist hermeneutics has some features. First, it is used and propagandized by the PRC elites who believe in the superiority of the unique China model. And second, it is an inadequate form of Kasia. And third, it is in control of a static, unchallengeable definition of the Chinese tradition. And such hermeneutics, I argue, is actually a representation of the autocratic tradition of Chinese politics, which originated from the Confucian legalist of orthodoxy established in the Western Han Dynasty under the rule of Emperor Wu Di. And in Xiao Hongquan's words, it's actually legalism with a Confucian facade, so it's kind of like 儒表法理, or a court. And the hermeneutics of one text or two texts, so the Zhou, the rise of Zhou, and also the spring and autumn Manu, the hermeneutics of the two texts has established a political power that in return controls the hermeneutics of all the texts. And this is actually something not new. I'm not actually like blaming this to like PRC, but it's a long problem since Western Han Dynasty, when is this? Like I guess 3rd century or 2nd century BC or something. So it's like more than 2,000 years ago in the intellectual history of China. And the problem of fitting the pre-Qin classics into the framework of what we call 正统 or 一统, okay? So the unity, everything is just like one, unity. The problem of fitting all the classical texts into this concept is that the resources of pluralistic and dynamic background of the pre-Qin era is not compatible with cultural absolutism and political totalitarianism. And such tension has been endured in China for more than 2 millennia till today. And for modern China, there's one more complication. After the collapse of Jingxue, the traditional study of Chinese philosophy, that is the 1905 abolishment of the examination system, over-examination system, the 科举制度, and the social class of 士大夫, the traditional Chinese scholars, there has been an institutional vacuum in the meta-narrative of Chinese foreign relations. The Spring and Autumn Annuals and the Rise of Zhou have lost their constitutional-like status. However, such vacuum has not undermined the deep-seated mentality of 正统 in people's thoughts and ways of interpreting the increasingly irrelevant classical canons. And that is actually a static view of the Chinese tradition. And I actually find something very interesting there, because if I just accept, okay, this is the only interpretation of the text, and there would be no other stories to talk about. But then I found something interesting from Professor Wang Gongwu. He's actually the ex-vice chancellor of this university, right? A very well-known historian and sinologist. And he argues in another way. To him, almost every aspect of Chineseness underwent considerable change during the past 3,000 years. Chineseness is a complex organism of ideas, values, and institutions which is living and changeable. It is a product of a shared historical experience whose record has continually influenced its growth.
Could you give us the spelling of this guy's name?
Professor Wang, W-A-N-G,
Yeah,
and Gongwu, G-U-N-G, W-U.
thank you.
Okay, thanks. I guess he's like an Australian by nationality, but then he's now somewhere in Singapore, Malaysia. Yeah? And he has a affiliation with ANU, the Australian National University in Australia. And Professor Wang's dynamic view of Chineseness has prompted him to argue that Confucian ideas and values are not monolithic. It is dangerous, as Wang argues, to identify Chineseness with Confucianism because such conventional elitist definition of the Chinese tradition is supportive of Great Han chauvinism, feminism, clannishness, localism, and particularism. Wang also implies the connection between Chineseness and the modern predicament faced by Chinese IR, and I quote from him: "The Chinese government will find conscious discussion of Chineseness embarrassing unless it can define it to fit its present situation. As long as the future Chineseness is still unclear, the world outside will continue to be ambivalent about China's traditional self-image." So this actually opens up the discussion of how we can actually have another understanding of what we call Chineseness or China, okay? Apart from Confucian legalism, what are other possible ways of understanding China? So, so that's how I actually find Hans-Georg Gadamer's theory quite interesting to be used. So, so when I look at his work, Truth and Method, I guess one of his very major work there, Gadamer actually argues that we should accept that prejudices are conditions of the understanding of the text because interpretations are all made of prejudices, while meaning is created by intersubjective communication between prejudices. A text is the result of a fusion of the interpretations of a tradition, and Gadamer calls it fusion of horizon, which means a harmonious inclusion of all previous opinions about the text. When the reader comes across with a text that is the object of hermeneutic understanding, he or she, in fact, is in a dialogue with a tradition. The relation between dialogue and understanding is one of the main themes in Gadamer's writings. Gadamer believes the dialogue between the past and the present, the alien and the familiar, the tradition and the interpreter is part of any sincere attempt to reach understanding or consensus. And Gadamer suggests a Hegelian, a dialectic solution, which involves a synthesis of different prejudices within the same tradition for a more refined point of view understood as a better moment of view. A critical examination of one's tradition involves appropriation and integration with the interpreter's own understanding. That is, to make use of both agreements and disagreements to the main prejudices of the tradition to create a more holistic and innovative picture of the tradition. Both perspectives are preserved. The result will be a unity or agreement that goes beyond the original positions of the various participants. And by using his theory, I actually suggest that there could be a double interpretation of the Chinese tradition. So it's something like this. So the first reading of the Chinese tradition will be a very Confucian legalist. So that's something that I guess we are more familiar with that. So we have one single set of things, right? Moral standards, or like vertical tradition, the way of looking at the world. So it's more monolithic. But if we actually acknowledge that the Chinese tradition can also be pluralistic, so when we look at the pre-Geneva, we find lots of different schools of thought, right? So those are Chinese as well. You can't say that those are not Chinese, right? So those are also Chinese. So if we look at China in that way as a pluralistic tradition or civilization, then there is another reading of it. And my argument is that you have to be more flexible and more liberal in thinking about this, and to make kind of like a dialogue between the two, and so that you can actually make the space of defining or negotiating what we call by Chinese as larger and larger. So if we just stick to the first reading, then we always have a lot of say like conflicts or like arguments. So say for example, say if I don't agree with the first reading, and then I want to replace the first reading, say with the Western standards, say like democracy, liberal democracy, human rights, all those things, then it's more like a paradigm shift, as argues by Thomas Kuhn. It's actually like we are actually shifting directly from one set of things to another thing, and we're actually getting rid of the previous original thing. But then if we use the second reading, then we can actually also argue that, okay, what we learned about the Western liberal democracy and also human rights, other things, the rule of law, we can actually find something similar in our own tradition. And this is actually, all these liberal Western things are actually not contradictory to what we call the Chinese things, right? So if we can actually communicate within our own tradition and try to actually enlarge our understanding of China, then I guess that we can actually get something more innovative. That's actually my point. So, okay, I better be quick. I suggest that there are actually something we can find useful in the classical text if we use a emancipated, a more liberal, cosmopolitan angle to look at those things. We have something quite interesting to notice. So traditionally, when we talk about Chinese law, of course, we mentioned that the propriety or right, and also the legalese fa, the penal law. Those are very important concepts in Chinese law, and their relations to the Western concept of electoral law and legal positivism. And I guess briefly, then I'll actually put it in this way. Okay, so the penal law is actually kind of like on the institutional level, and the li is actually kind of like more idealistic, more utopian standard. Okay, say when you read the Analects of Confucius, you actually notice that he always talks about how we should actually go back to the Sage Kings period. Go back to the previous very moral, very ethical era of China, that everyone, especially the rulers, the leaders, they're acting according to Li. So that's actually a very high moral standard. And when you look at those moral values, when you compare to the Western tradition of natural law, you have something interesting to compare. Kind of like, I can't say they are totally equal, no, but then something similar. But then my next question will be like, so from these two very different traditions, can we actually negotiate something and achieve something more, right? So, so something called the universal conscience or universal reason, higher law, whatever, you know. Because when we are dealing with international law, we are doing the international rule of law, then inevitably we are talking about how a rising China is actually going to negotiate with the currently existing international legal norms and institutions. And you have this problem there. So how do you actually talk to each other, right? So, so I'm actually quite interested in how to make the Li actually into something like a revived natural law or reinvented cosmopolitanism, which can make a good dialogue with the Western tradition of natural law. And can we actually, I mean, from that results, can we actually have something like a jus gentium commensurated, you know? And when I read, say like, well, this is Western, again, you can say I'm actually biased, but then say when you read Sophocles' Antigone, you know, you actually notice that Sophocles says, I mean, it's actually like mentioning something related to higher law. Say like the law as mentioned as Antigone's law is actually a higher law that even gods obey them. It's actually even higher than what we define as the rule of law in the Anglo-American tradition, you know, like when we talk about the rule of law nowadays, most of us, we are talking about the law should be above the government, above the sovereign, right? But then for Sophocles, it's even higher, you know, like even the gods, they are obeying them. So do we have something like really of that level? And so this is something like, I just show you some samples there I found from those texts, okay? So from the Chronicle of Zhuo, it's actually the, one of the interpretations of the Spring Autumn Annual, okay? A more historical interpretation of that. And you have these quotations which you can find people at that time, they sort of understand Li, or the law, together with the heaven, the way, or the Tao as well. So you can see kind of like natural law element there. And it's very early, back in the pre-Qin period. And also, it's very important that you have to be loyal and you have to love the people. That's actually a very important concept there. So you have the people, you have the faithful worship of the spirit, that's the like heaven, you know, like a more religious section of it, and you have the law there. So we have these three elements there, and when you compare it to the natural law tradition, I guess it's quite interesting. You've got all the elements there, right? And okay, just finish it. And for some text, even if they are reinterpreted, they are apparently not suitable for the reinvention of Cosmopolitanism. So these are not suitable, I think. So the categorization of Jiuzhou, you know, Sihai, you know, like this is the old kind of geographical concept. And of course, we know how the world looks like now. Okay, go Google, you know the world map. And also the 5 services, and also like this one, Chinese people and all barbarians have their unique temperaments which cannot be changed. This is kind of like racist thing, I guess, right? So I find this is not really useful. But then there are also something that we can use, but to be handled with care. To be handled with care, okay? So say for example, this one is, the first one is very famous, I guess, especially during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, right? So people within 4 seas are to be treated as those in one family. So what do we mean by, now this is interpretation, right? What do we mean by 4 Cs and one family? What kind of family, right? So if we define 4 Cs as the globe and one family as the whole humanity, that's quite cosmopolitan. If you define it in another way, there would be another result. And the second one, all lands under the heaven are the king's lands. All people within the world boundary are the king's subjects. And for this one, the heaven should mean the globe. The king, we can actually refer to the UN. And the subjects should be the global citizens, but the dominant-subordinate relationship must be eliminated there. So this is to be handled with care. And this is from Mencius. So the unity here should not confuse with the Chinese character Tong, what we call Tong, in Confucian legalism. The concept of plurality must exist alongside with unity. I guess it's a little bit like the motto of the European Union, united in diversity. And the other saying from Guoyu, from the discourses of the states, I guess this is very useful. Yeah, things differ but coexist in harmony may develop. Sameness does not yield perpetuity. Very straightforward, I guess, this one. It's all about pluralism. This is very famous, of course, right? Very famous from the Book of Rights. And I guess this is the spirit of global democracy to me. And 天下 actually should mean the global community. The relationship with parents and children can be interpreted as caring for all humans as if they are our family members. Very famous one. And these two, I guess they have something to do with humanitarian intervention. And if you define the empire as the whole world, and the feudal laws as the sovereign states, then the first one, when the way does not prevail in the empire, the rights and the music and the punitive expeditions are initiated by the feudal laws. That makes me think about the coalition of the willing. You know? What we have in Iraq, in Afghanistan, you know, like those problems we have, and I guess we are living in the world that the way does not prevail. But then when the way prevails in the empire, in the world, then all those things they initiate by the empire. By the emperor. And that could actually mean that if you have a strong international institution, say like very strong UN, especially the Security Council, a very legitimate one, by hard power, a very powerful one as well, then the people won't complain a lot because the world is going to be more peaceful and just. So you have a little bit like a liberal institutionalist argument there when you compare to contemporary IR. And this one as well, it just simply means that the most peaceful, the most ideal situation in international relations is that like all the states, all the regimes, or like all those sovereigns, they actually behave themselves. They behave themselves so that the United Nations or the so-called a little bit higher global authority, it doesn't need to worry about anything. So everybody is behaving himself or herself, and you'll be fine. You'll be fine, right? Very idealist. Sorry about this. It's too much, I know. But it's just like comparison between the two interpretation. And by talking about the cosmopolitan interpretation, I refer a lot to the UN and how the Chinese authority can actually contribute more to liberal institutionalism in nowadays world. Sorry. I just wrap up with this PowerPoint. very briefly. I haven't got any text for you for these things, but then I found something related to pluralism and egalitarianism in reading the Chinese classics. And the first thing is about the pluralistic origin of the Qin Empire. Professor Victoria Hui, she actually made very heavy criticism on the Qin Empire. And she actually believes that that's actually the origin of Chinese totalitarianism and the monolithic mentality. And what she actually didn't mention, I think, is that the Qin Empire actually had a very pluralistic beginning because it's actually before the 117 years before the unification of China, the first empire, then the Qin kingdom at that time is actually quite poor. Like the Qin kingdom is actually located in the central western part of China. It's actually not comparable to the coastal areas, say like the Qi kingdom and also the Chu and those more wealthy ones. But they actually turned out to be the most powerful one and then united the whole China. Why? One of the reasons is that before, right before the unification, 17 I guess, 17 out of the 22, 17 out of the 22 prime ministers of the kingdom were actually foreigners. Foreigners. So they are actually like using a lot of people from other states to help them. And I think this is a kind of evidence there for you. And for the early Tang period as well, when you look at the empires, the emperor, say Tang Taizong, the Emperor Taizong, he actually has this kind of a dual identity in him. He's actually representing himself as a Confucian, kind of like heavenly endowed Tianzi, what we call the empire of the Han race. But he's also like, he has a Turkish heritage there in his blood as well. And when we look at Chinese Buddhism, of course, in those texts, we find a lot as well. Say like, in Buddhism, we talk about all lives are equal, not just among human beings, but also between humans and animals, all lives. And we talk about compassion and those things. So I guess they have something useful there too. So this is just like I guess we have some inspirations for international legal norms entrepreneurship. So I guess that's what I want to talk about. Sorry for overrunning. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Walter, for a most inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. I think since this seminar is supposed to end at 1:30, I think I'll extend it by a few minutes so that at least we can have a few questions. Maybe I'll collect some questions and comments, and then we'll ask Walter to respond generally.
Oh, sure. You want me to start?
I think the gentleman at the back, and then it was a good question.
Thanks, Walter. I found it utterly fascinating, and I feel like I learned a great deal. But I want to ask you one thing. So I think your paper is fantastic, important, timely, but there is a tension in your kind of philosophical assumptions that I find interesting. It's basically, from my point of view, it's intellectually incoherent, but in a fascinating way. So it's not a criticism. In that you want to reject the Western tradition and you are appropriating it at the same time. Cosmopolitanism is a concept that comes out of the Enlightenment. And when you buy into post-structuralism, postmodernism, whatever you want to call it, then you kind of want to reject the Enlightenment, right? And you know, like, I don't know whether you can conceptualize it while you completely reject Western tradition. And the funny thing is, though, that the way you describe the Western tradition for your argument to work you have to use a caricature of the West, and you object to caricaturing Chinese tradition.
So what's that word?
Caricature. Caricature.
Okay.
That it is a distorted view of the Western tradition, because there is a great plurality within the West, that the West is pluralistic, the Enlightenment is the part of that pluralism. And one thinker I think that might be relevant to, in addition to Gadamer, is Edmund Burke, actually. Edmund Burke is one of the early critics of the Enlightenment. He rejected cosmopolitanism as a kind of fruitless concept, because people are always embedded in their cultures, in the traditions. But Edmund Burke can be seen as one of the early liberals too. And his project was to engage with your particular tradition. So he defended English liberties as saw them as being inheritance of England. And he would urge people to engage with local traditions and think what works for them. And then from Burke I would move to Immanuel Kant, who talks about cosmopolitanism openly. But he also talks about the civilized way of dealing with each other. So, you know, when you had that slide early on, and you said in that one definition, well, it's only about civilized nations, that excludes everyone because it is defining this discourse in Western terms. But I just think you can't have it both ways. I mean, if you reject that talk about civilized nations, then you can't accept talk about cosmopolitanism. So that's my, yeah. I don't know. It's a big question I raise.
I think maybe we'll collect the one.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
And a very brief addendum is: does this matter to contemporary China? So you said you are not going to convince Western scholars about this and that, but would that have resonance in contemporary China? Would leaders there in Beijing think, yes, we can relate to these values? Thanks.
Thank you. And then Professor Goodrich.
Well, I'm conscious, I think, that everything has now been asked, but I could maybe add, I mean, I kind of agree that there's an irony, and it would be interesting to see you develop the irony of recuperating ancient Chinese texts using a European methodology. And if I understand the previous question, I might sort of formulate it in a different way, which is that the Western legal tradition is a self-consciously Christian tradition, and to what extent does that Christian imperium preclude the sort of recovery of pluralistic religions when monotheism, by its very nature and existence, is antithetical to those? And then finally, just mimicking the previous question, do you have a positive theory of the institution? Because you seem very stuck in method, and I wondered whether outside of the methodological turmoil, you had a positive notion of what you would want the institution to be. And I think you made only the most kind of glancing reference to the UN being a strong institution, and that would be your value. But I wondered if you could elaborate somewhat.
Thank you. Is there a last question or comment?
Well, we should.
Yes, Tony, you have the last word in terms of question or comment.
I remember it's related to part of Peter's question. It's a lot of fun and listening to this and being reminded of these various people, like Calvin and Victoria Gray, and this Chi historian, or international relations theory. But it appears to me that there are a lot of problems with what you're doing, and the one main one being that you're doing too many things, and so one ends up sort of asking. I would be quite worried about your PhD viva, because I would sort of say, if I was your examiner, well, what is your thesis? You know, what is your argument? Because I don't see an argument or a thesis here. And I'm reminded of a very funny lecture instance in British International Studies Association, and this fellow Chris Brown gave a lecture. He was a kind of doyen of British International Relations at the LSE, and he gave a lecture on methodological problems of international relations. And there was some very witty Israeli commentator who said, international relations seems to be suffering from a permanent kind of puberty crisis, adolescence about what it is and what it's doing. And I think that this crisis has got hold of you. You seem, despite the title of International Legal Norms and Entrepreneurship, you seem to be coming out of Anglo-Australian, American international relations studies and all the questions that they pose. And these people are adolescent, as this Israeli scholar said. They cannot make up their minds what it is they're doing. And they just write, you have Cambridge Studies in International Relations, which is about 123 different methods for doing international relations. And usually young scholars end up trying to eclectically, and this is the fundamental problem, eclectically picking bits and pieces from all of these different theories so that somehow or other their approach doesn't leave out any really significant theory, but doesn't have any internal contradictions. And to me, you're just exhausting yourself. I mean, why can't you just go away and read the classics and enjoy them? And as for asking what the PRC is up to, or what the Chinese government is up to, and whether it can use all of this stuff, I mean, there's no point in asking that question, in my opinion. I mean, nobody knows what these people are up to. And who cares? Anyway, they may not even be there tomorrow.
So Walter, in your Viva, you just respond to him by saying, do you have a question?
My question is, what is your question?
Okay, so
What is your
since
question?
we are conscious of the time, so we will invite Walter
Very
to
brief,
just
yeah.
generally respond, and then we can then have a happy lunch.
I'll have a nice lunch. We still have some cyber to go.
Well, thanks for all the questions, and I have to say that this is actually just one part of my thesis. So
You have another 100 tables.
So I have a question and my own argument there. My thesis is actually on humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. And I'm actually asking whether it's possible for China and the legal West to reconcile the conceptual divergence in humanitarian intervention. So on the
Between
one,
modern Chinese international law and Western Chinese international
yeah, between the PRC's non-interventionism, and the liberal internationalism.
Oh, well, yeah, that's certainly an international law question.
Yeah, so I'm asking whether it's possible to reconcile these two, and my argument is that
Maybe you just respond to
right.
the
Walter, forget about Tony's comment. Particularly in relation to your Viva, you are just fine.
No, okay. So just make sure I have a question and then.
What about Peter and Christianity and Stefan and whatever it is, Enlightenment?
Yeah, but then I'll actually say it because I'm actually trained in the more Anglo-American tradition. Say I mean in IR. I mean
yeah, that's what
so that's why I guess what you say is
very
very valid. Sometimes I'm not actually aware of what I'm studying, and that's actually very valid. And I guess I also think that I acknowledge that I have difficulty here to try to build up something in common between China and the West, and that's actually how to construct my argument there could be. I guess it's a difficulty of what kind of language you have to use. Say you want something common, then I'm doing this research in English, and then the only word I can use is cosmopolitanism, and of course that word actually has its own cultural, historical, all those values embedded there. And then this is something that I guess is a linguistic question there. I can't actually get rid of it. But then if I don't use the word cosmopolitanism, I have nothing to say. What kind of words can I use, right? So But then of course I actually agree with three of you, yeah, Professor Rich and also Stephen said about I have something kind of positive, as you said, in my thesis, but then it's more like in the later parts of my thesis, and then because with the limitation of the work length there, I guess I have to work more on that. But from those direct readings of those classical texts, I definitely have something to suggest for nowadays policy. So that's like more suggestive thing.
Okay, so thank you very much, Walter. So we wish you a successful library. And you're most welcome to visit us again,
Okay,
and to give your third seminar at our Center for Comparative.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much, and thank you, members of the audience, for coming to this seminar. So Houghton, Houghton, have you met Professor Good?
Yeah, we met. We actually have a common friend who's the R&D.
Thank you.
Yeah, Houghton will be joining
your
our
message.
lunch.
Yeah. So I just have
I was just going to confirm it then.
And I want to invite Bishop to that.
Right.
Unless she's too busy.
No problem. The most important thing is
And then
Do you
the
want vegetarian
I thought
or
it's good to give
non-vegetarian?
ourselves
Because there's
a
one
I'm very
vegetarian.
happy